The air smelled like rust and old paper when they opened the storage unit in Cedar Falls, Iowa. It was March 1985. A woman named Diane Harmon had inherited the space from her uncle's estate, a man she'd met only twice before he died. Inside, beneath tax documents and military medals, she found a tin box wrapped in oilcloth. When she pried it open, 3 photographs slipped out. They showed 2 boys, maybe 8 and 10 years old, standing in front of a barn. Their eyes were hollow. Their clothes were too clean for farm children. On the back of one photo in faded pencil, someone had written, "The Carter Boys. Forgive us." Diane didn't know any Carters, but the photos disturbed her enough that she brought them to the Cedar Falls Historical Society. That's when the archivist recognized the barn. It had burned down in 1953, taking its secrets with it, or so everyone believed. What Diane Harmon had found was the beginning of a story that would unravel one of the Midwest's most carefully guarded family tragedies. A story about 2 boys who vanished from public record in 1938, only to reappear decades later with a confession that destroyed everything their family had built. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is the story of the Carter Boys, what they lived through, what they were forced to become, and what they finally told the world when silence was no longer possible. This isn't folklore. This isn't legend. This is documented history that was buried because it was too disturbing to face. The kind of truth that makes you wonder what other stories are hidden in locked boxes, waiting for someone brave enough to open them. The Carter Boys were found in 1985. What they confessed destroyed everything. The Carter family owned 340 acres of farmland just outside Millbrook, Iowa, a town so small it didn't appear on most state maps. In 1935, when the Dust Bowl was choking families across the plains, the Carters seemed untouched. Their soil was dark and rich. Their crops came in heavy. People in town called it luck. Others called it something else. The family kept to themselves, attended church on Sundays, and never asked for help. That was the American way back then. Suffer quietly, smile in public, keep your doors locked. Thomas Carter ran the farm with his wife Margaret and their 4 children. The 2 oldest were boys William, born in 1927, and Robert, born in 1929. There were 2 younger daughters as well, but their names were scrubbed from most records after what happened. William and Robert were described by neighbors as polite, obedient, and unnaturally quiet. A school teacher later recalled that William once came to class with a black eye, and when asked about it, he said he'd walked into a door. She didn't believe him. But in 1937, you didn't question a man about how he raised his sons. Then in the summer of 1938, the boys disappeared. Not in the way you might think. They didn't run away. They didn't die in an accident. They simply stopped appearing in town. The school was told the boys were being homeschooled. The church was told they were helping with the harvest. When a neighbor asked Margaret Carter where her sons were, she smiled and said they were staying with relatives in Nebraska. But there were no relatives in Nebraska. There never had been. For 15 years, no one saw William and Robert Carter. Their names vanished from census records. Their births were registered, but their childhoods became a gap in the historical record. A blank space that no one thought to question. In small towns, people learn not to ask too many questions. Families had secrets. The Depression made people cruel in ways they'd never admit. And the Carters kept farming, kept attending church, kept smiling until 1953 when the barn burned. And even then, no one knew what had been hidden inside. The barn stood at the far edge of the Carter property, nearly a mile from the main house. It was built in 1912, back when Thomas Carter's father first broke the land. The structure was massive, 3 stories tall with a gable roof and walls thick enough to keep the Iowa winter out. But after 1938, no one except Thomas Carter was allowed inside. He kept it padlocked. He told the hired man it was used for storage for equipment, too valuable to leave exposed. Once a farm hand named Eugene Pratt tried to peer through a gap in the boards. Thomas caught him and fired him on the spot. Eugene left town the next day and never spoke about what he thought he'd seen or heard. The fire started on a February night in 1953. It was the coldest winter in 20 years, and the flames could be seen from 3 miles away, a roaring orange glow against the frozen fields. By the time neighbors arrived, the barn was already collapsing inward. The heat so intense it melted the snow in a perfect circle round the foundation. Thomas Carter stood watching, his face lit by the fire, and he didn't move to save anything. When the fire chief asked what was inside, Thomas said, "Farm equipment and old furniture. Nothing important, nothing worth risking a life for." But when the ashes cooled, the fire inspector found something that didn't belong: chains. Heavy iron chains bolted into the support beams on the second floor and beneath the charred wood. In what had been the barn's cellar, they found the remnants of 2 small beds, little more than wooden pallets with rotted blankets. There were tin plates, a rusted bucket, and scratched into one of the beams, barely visible under the soot, were 2 sets of initials: W. C. and R.C. William Carter, Robert Carter. The inspector filed a report, but Thomas Carter was a respected man, a deacon at the church, and the town decided the findings were inconclusive. Maybe the chains had been for livestock. Maybe the beds were for seasonal workers. Maybe the initials were a coincidence. The report was buried in a county file cabinet, and no one asked about the Carter boys again. Thomas died of a heart attack in 1961. Margaret followed in 1969. The farm was sold. The land was plowed over, and the story should have ended there. But secrets don't die, they wait. When Diane Harmon brought those photographs to the Cedar Falls Historical Society, she had no idea what she was about to uncover. The archivist, a woman named Ruth Holloway, had lived in the area her entire life. She recognized the barn immediately. She'd been a teenager when it burned, and she remembered the rumors that followed: whispers at the general store, hushed conversations that stopped when children walked by. Ruth had always wondered what really happened to the Carter boys, but like everyone else, she'd learned not to ask. The photographs were dated on the back, July 1937, just 1 year before the boys disappeared. Ruth began pulling files, cross-referencing census records, school registrations, church directories. What she found was chilling. William and Robert Carter appeared in the 1930 census. They appeared in school records through the spring of 1938. Then nothing: no graduation records, no employment records, no marriage licenses, no death certificates. It was as if they'd been erased. Ruth contacted the Iowa State Records Office. She filed requests with the Social Security Administration. She even reached out to the Veterans Affairs Office, thinking maybe the boys had enlisted under different names. And that's when she found them. Not in Iowa, not under the name Carter, but in a psychiatric facility in Oregon, admitted in 1953, the same year the barn burned. 2 men, both using the surname Morrison, both listing their birthplace as unknown. The attending physician's notes described them as severely traumatized, nonverbal for the first 6 months of treatment, and suffering from what would now be recognized as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Ruth made the call. She spoke to a social worker who had access to the sealed files, and that social worker, after verifying Ruth's credentials and the historical nature of the inquiry, revealed something that made Ruth's blood run cold. The 2 men had eventually begun to speak. They'd participated in therapy, and in 1984, just months before Diane Harmon found those photographs, they had given a full recorded testimony about their childhood, about what happened in that barn, about why they'd hidden for 30 years before anyone found them. The social worker said the testimony was the most disturbing thing she'd ever heard in 23 years of clinical work. William Carter was 58 years old when he finally spoke about his childhood. Robert was 56. They were living in a supervised care facility in Portland, having never fully integrated into society, never married, never held jobs for longer than a few months. The therapist who recorded their testimony said they spoke in turns as if they'd rehearsed the story 1,000 times in their heads, but never had permission to say it out loud. Their voices were flat, emotionless, like men reading from a script written by someone else, but the details were specific, too specific to be fabricated. They said it started in the spring of 1938, after their father caught William stealing a piece of bread from the kitchen, not for himself. For Robert, who'd been sick with fever, Thomas Carter decided the boys needed discipline. He said they'd grown soft, disobedient, corrupted by school teachers who filled their heads with ideas above their station. So he moved them to the barn. He told Margaret it would be temporary, just a few weeks to teach them the value of hard work and obedience. Margaret didn't argue. In those days, a wife didn't question her husband's authority, especially not a man like Thomas Carter. The boys were given a list of rules. They were to wake at dawn and work until dusk. They were to speak only when spoken to. They were not to leave the barn for any reason. Meals would be brought to them. Thomas installed the chains himself, fastening them to the support beams on the second floor where the boys slept. He said it was for their own safety to keep them from running away in the night, but the chains were too short to stand fully upright. William said they learned to sleep in a crouch, their backs bent, their wrists rubbed raw from the iron cuffs. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Weeks became months. Months became years. The boys said their father visited them every evening after supper. He would read from the Bible passages about obedience and suffering and the sins of pride. He would ask them if they'd learned their lesson, if they were ready to rejoin the family. And every time they said yes, he would shake his head and say they were lying, that he could see the rebellion still burning in their eyes. Robert remembered begging. William remembered silence. Neither worked. The brothers told the therapist that they lost track of time after the first year. Seasons blurred together. Winter meant the barn was freezing, their breath visible in the darkness, their fingers numb even. Under the thin blankets their mother would leave at the bottom of the ladder. Summer meant suffocating heat, the air thick and still. Flies gathering on the plates of food that sat too long before they could reach them. They were given enough to survive, but never enough to feel human. Oatmeal in the morning, bread and water at midday, a tin of beans in the evening if they'd worked hard enough. Their father decided what hard enough meant. William said he tried to keep Robert sane by telling stories. He'd make up elaborate tales about places they'd go when they finally got out, cities they'd visit, meals they'd eat. Robert said those stories were the only thing that kept him from losing his mind completely. But as the years stretched on, even the stories started to feel like lies. They stopped talking about escape. They stopped talking about the future. They just existed day after day in a space that smelled like rotting wood and their own unwashed bodies. Their mother brought the food but never spoke to them. She wouldn't meet their eyes. William said he hated her more than he hated his father, because at least his father believed he was doing something righteous, something necessary. Their mother knew it was wrong and did nothing. Once in 1942, Robert became violently ill. He was vomiting, feverish, delirious. Margaret stood at the bottom of the ladder and watched him suffer for 3 days before finally bringing a doctor. The doctor was told the boy had been injured in a farming accident and was recovering in the barn. Because the house was too crowded, the doctor gave him medicine and never asked why a 16-year-old boy was chained like an animal. The brothers said they thought about killing their father. They talked about it in whispers after he left each night. They imagined a dozen different ways to do it, but the chains kept them from reaching the ladder. And even if they'd gotten free, they didn't know where they'd go. They had no money, no identification. They'd been erased from the world. William said the worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the realization that no one was coming to save them, that they'd been forgotten, that their father had successfully convinced the entire town that his sons simply didn't exist anymore. And in a way, he was right. They stopped being boys. They became something else, something broken. The fire in 1953 wasn't an accident. William admitted that in his testimony, though he said it with no emotion, no pride, no shame. He said it the way someone might describe washing dishes or folding laundry. By that point, they'd been in the barn for 15 years. William was 26 years old. Robert was 24. They'd spent more of their lives in chains than in freedom. Their bodies were twisted from years of sleeping in cramped positions. Their minds had learned to survive by shutting down everything except the most basic functions. But somewhere beneath the numbness, a spark remained. Thomas Carter had grown careless. He was older, His hands shook, and he'd stopped checking the chains as carefully as he once did. One night in February, William worked his wrist free. It took hours. The skin tore. Blood made the metal slick, but he got loose, and then he freed Robert. They didn't run immediately. They waited until their father fell asleep in the house. Then William found a kerosene lamp, the kind Thomas used when he came to read his Bible passages. William said he didn't think about it. He just acted. He poured the kerosene along the base of the barn and struck a match. They ran. They walked through the frozen fields until their feet bled, then kept walking. They stole clothes from a farmhouse 20 meters away. They hopped a freight train heading west. They changed their names to Morrison, their mother's maiden name, though they never explained why they chose to keep any connection to the family that destroyed them. For months they moved from town to town, working odd jobs, sleeping in shelters, too traumatized to trust anyone. Eventually, they ended up in Oregon, where a social worker noticed something was wrong and got them into the psychiatric system. That's where they stayed for the next 32 years, when Ruth Holloway finally contacted them in 1985. William and Robert were given the choice of whether to go public with their story. They declined. They said they'd already said everything they needed to say in their therapy sessions, and they had no interest in reliving it for strangers. They didn't want money. They didn't want justice. Thomas and Margaret Carter were already dead. The farm was gone. The barn was ash. What would punishment look like for ghosts? The brothers died within 6 months of each other in the early 2000s. Their story known only to a handful of social workers, historians, and now you. The photographs Diane Harmon found were donated to the Iowa Historical Society, where they remain in a climate-controlled archive. The therapy recordings are sealed under medical privacy laws and will likely never be released. There's no memorial for William and Robert Carter, no marker where the barn once stood. The land is now a soybean field owned by an agricultural corporation that has no idea what happened there. The Carter family name died with the brothers, and that's exactly what Thomas Carter wanted, to erase his son so completely that even their suffering would be forgotten. But here's what he didn't understand. Stories like this don't disappear. They hide. They wait. They surface when someone opens the wrong box, or asks the wrong question, or refuses to look away from something the rest of the world decided was better left buried. The Carter boys were found in 1985. What they confessed destroyed the family's story, but it also gave them something they'd never had. The truth, witnessed, remembered, believed, and now you carry it too. If this story affected you, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're from. Tell us you were here, because that's how we make sure stories like this are never forgotten.